confusion and say that our last but not least distinguished speaker is actually Madame Lise Bergh, who is the Secretary General for the Swedish section of the Amnesty International, an organization which is very well known to all of us for its work in the human rights field. Madame Bergh holds a degree from the Stockholm University. She has worked with the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, and she also served as a Deputy Quality Ombudsman and Secretary of State for responsibility for integration, equality, human rights, democracy, and national minorities. Madame Bergh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Of course, first I also want to thank you, for the invitation to address you in this context. I am representing civil society, so I would like to talk a little bit about the reality on the ground, actually. And I have chosen to speak about the right to freedom of expression and the right of freedom of peaceful assembly and association. And the reason is that they are fundamental rights in a democracy, and they are also attacked consistently around the world. But having said that, I would also stress that all human rights are equal. There is no hierarchy. So I think that is important to stress all the time. The protection of human rights is enshrined in numerous international conventions and treaties, as you all know, of course. But I will start by quickly highlight parts of the international law as it is the foundation of human rights. And I personally think, that there is a need to refresh oneself now and then, just to know what we are talking about. The basis is the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And in the preamble, it is stated that the member states have undertaken, in collaboration with the United Nations, the promotion of universal respect and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and that a common understanding of the meaning of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance to meet these commitments. And I will come back to that later on. The Universal Declaration has then subsequently led to the United Nations to develop a large collection of legally binding international conventions and treaties. If I return then to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it states in its Article 19 that all have the right to freedom of opinion and expression without interference. And it also includes the right to impart information and ideas without regard to borders. And this right can only be restricted by law and with regard to the rights of reputation of others and the protection of national security. And in its Article 20, it says that everyone has the right to peacefully come together, to make one's views visible, to protest, to criticize, or to express one's views otherwise. It also contains the right to freedom of association. And this right can only be restricted by law and with regards to the interest of national security or public safety, public order, the protection of public health or morals, or human rights and freedoms of others. And as you all know, the protection of human rights is also regulated at the regional level in Europe, North and South America, Africa, and Middle East. All the UN and the regional conventions, they are based on the Universal Declaration. But there are right now, or not right now, but there are worrying tendencies to try to erode rights by reference to culture, tradition, and customs. And here I want to remind you again of the preamble of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, where all the signatories agreed that a common understanding of the meaning of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance in order to meet their commitments. But there is no common understanding of tradition, culture, or religion, actually. And we have often, and I guess all of you also, have often both seen and heard how states have referred to tradition, culture, or religion to defend measures that in fact are violations of human rights. And I will just give you two examples that demonstrate that this trend now takes a more formal expression, actually. And the first example is that the members of the ASEAN has adopted a declaration on human rights that we think from Amnesty, and I think for many other human rights organizations, is quite worrying. Because this declaration states that the enjoyment of rights should be, I quote, balanced against how citizens live up to their obligations, end of quote, and that they must be adapted to, I quote again, national and regional conditions and take into account the cultural, religious, and historical factors. Unless, as we see it, significant changes are made to this declaration, it will actually give member states additional powers to violate human rights rather than to provide citizens in the region a stronger protection against such violations. And the second example happened this year, quite recently, I think, in the UN Human Rights Council, which adopted a resolution that dealt with traditional values and their role in relation to human rights. And the countries that voted against the resolution, they argued that there is no agreed definition of the concept of traditional values, and that this concept can instead be used to justify violations of human rights, such as women's human rights, such as LGBT persons' rights. And they also argued that the vagueness and subjectivity of the concept of traditional values is against the principle that human rights apply to everyone always. And this resolution was passed with 25 votes in favor and 15 against and 7 abstentions. And I will also say that the resolution asked that the matter should be further investigated in a number of aspects. But I think that this can happen in other regions and in other forums, and I think we need to react so that the universality of human rights is not undermined. Freedom of speech and opinion guarantee and shape public opinion, and everyone should be able to take part in and also express a diversity of opinions, and together with the freedom of the media, examine and express their views on how public power is exercised. And around the world, as many of us know, people are subjected to threats and harassment because of their opinions. Often it doesn't halt with harassments, but persons deemed uncomfortable for those in power in oppressive countries are arrested, they are tortured, and in some cases killed. And their only crime is that they have made use of their fundamental right to freedom of expression, or the freedom to express their opinions, or their freedom to assembly and association. Restrictions of these rights are, of course, nothing new. It is the first tool used by governments or heads of states to silence dissidents or critics. And governments very often refer to national security or defamation of state or head of states as a reason for restricting political opposition and criticism. And after the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on the 11th of September 2001, the fear of terrorism has been used as an excuse to increase restrictions on the freedom of expression of individuals as well as groups, restrictions that very often have no connection whatsoever to terrorism. Of course, each state has both a duty and a right to protect its citizens and combat terrorism. But this must be done within the law and with respect for human rights. And we have seen that many of the anti-terror laws that have been enacted since 2001 have been very vague and have had broad definitions and are often used in many countries to restrict free speech and punish critics. And as you also know, that journalists are often the target and are harassed and abused. But, as many have said, of course, open debate and respect for human rights is the only framework in which security and development can be promoted. I have chosen now to provide some examples of where freedom of speech and opinion and freedom of assembly and association are oppressed, and how Amnesty engage in it, and all of you I know engage in it. And note that these are only examples, actually. And I will talk about Azerbaijan first. On the 6th to 9th November, Baku, the capital city of Azerbaijan, hosted the annual Internet Governance Forum. This multi-stakeholder dialogue, it was established by the United Nations in 2006, included discussions of internet-related human rights issues, and in particular freedom of speech, which made, as I see, the choice of venue for the event deeply ironic in a way. Because in Azerbaijan, people who exercise this fundamental right to criticize the president, his family, or government risk being threatened, attacked, or imprisoned, whether they do so on or offline. Azerbaijan has already enjoyed a turn on the international stage earlier this year when it hosted the Eurovision Song Contest in May. And on that occasion, local activists and organizations took advantage of the attention to highlight human rights concerns in the country to a wider audience. And since then, and following a decrease in media attention post-Eurovision, these activists have started to be targeted, being harassed by police and arrested on fabricated charges. 20 years of independence, economic prosperity, and relatively stability in Azerbaijan have failed to significantly improve the country's human rights record and the fundamental freedoms of its citizens. Amnesty has long been concerned by the determination of the Azerbaijani authorities to stifle dissent, and this crackdown on free speech and peaceful assembly has intensified in recent years. Peaceful anti-government protest has effectively been criminalized by banning demonstrations and imprisoning those who organize or take part in them. Police use excessive force to break up peaceful but officially unsanctioned demonstrations. Threats and intimidation against human rights defenders have been used together with legislative and administrative means to shut down and deny registration to civil society groups working on democracy and human rights issues. And self-censorship has increased, because criticism of the president and leading government figures is frequently punished, whether it is voiced through politics, journalism, satire, activism, education, or even social networking websites. And journalists have been beaten, ill-treated, abducted, and imprisoned, while the range of independent media outlets has been curbed through laws banning foreign broadcasters from national airwaves. And also new methods of exercising the right to freedom of expression, such as using the internet and social media, are also under siege. And we have called on the Azerbaijan authorities, together with other organizations, to end the harassment, intimidation, arbitrary detention, and criminal prosecution of all those who peacefully express dissenting views. And also to immediately and unconditionally release all prisoners of conscience, and those are people detained solely for their peaceful exercise of their rights. And also, of course, allow independent media outlets, journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, and other civil society activists to operate freely, carrying out their legitimate activities without fear of reprisal. I will also talk a little bit about Belarus. On the 10th of October this year, the Belarusian authorities denied a visa to Amnesty International's researchers on Belarus. And this is the first time in 20 years that the organization has been stopped from visiting the country. And this decision comes at a time of serious deterioration of human rights in Belarus, Following the presidential elections in December 2010, key opposition figures have been detained and convicted in, as we see it, unfair trials, and many have been ill-treated to force them into signing confessions. The authorities are engaged in a persistent campaign of harassment and intimidation of human rights defenders and opposition and civil society activists across the country. And there are daily reports of activists being detained, arrested, or charged, of lawyers being disbarred for defending detainees, and of journalists being harassed, and of media outlets and human rights organizations being intimidated and obstructed from going about their legitimate work. And non-governmental organizations are under increasing pressure and face prosecution and liquidation under laws that violate the right to freedom of association. And in October last year, a new law on public associations came into force. And according to this law, all Belarusian NGOs are prohibited from holding funds or bank accounts abroad. And this is clearly being used to silence national human rights organizations. And one example is Vyasna, whose chairperson, Ales Bialyatsky, was sentenced to 4.5 years on the 24th of November 2011 after an unfair trial. And the sentence relates to the use of personal bank accounts in Lithuania and Poland to support the work of Vyasna in Belarus. And the eviction was part of a sentence also imposed on Vyasna's chair a year ago. And just a few days ago, representatives of the Ministry of Justice, police, and city gas company actually arrived at the Minsk office of Human Rights Center Vyasna to close it down and seal off the premises. And another example is also the NGO Platforma, an organization which monitors prison conditions. It was liquidated by a court order for failing to present the income declaration on time and for not informing the authorities of a change of address. And none of this was true. They had presented their income declaration on time and they had not moved address. So the verdict was based on a totally fake indictment. I would also finish by saying a few words on worrying developments in Russia. Just a week ago, on the 21st November, a new law which regulates the activities of non-commercial organizations performing the functions of foreign agents came into effect. And I am sure that you have heard about this legislation. The law imposes a legal obligation on Russian non-governmental organizations which receive foreign aid in any form and engage in what the law loosely defines as political activities. They are imposed to register as, and I quote, organizations performing the functions of foreign agents, end of quote. And it also makes provisions for hefty fines and other severe administrative penalties, as well as criminal prosecution, including imprisonment for failure to obey to this requirement. And since the draft bill was introduced in July, we, Amnesty and other organizations, have expressed grave concerns about the consequences this will have on civil society and NGOs, because it will place a significant financial and administrative burden on independent Russian civil society organizations. And it is also obvious that it will seek to discredit such organizations in the eyes of Russia general public, because the wording foreign agents carries negative connotations in Russian and is often used as synonymous with spying, actually. So this law will stifle, as we see it, civil society developments in Russia, and is very likely also to be used to silence critical voices, which very often depend on external funding to ensure their independence of the Russian authorities. A number of prominent Russian human rights and other NGOs have indicated that they would refuse to register as foreign agents and risk suspension of their activities and other consequences, rather than so endorsing this deliberately provocative misrepresentation of their objectives and of the nature of their activities. And this law is not the only example of measures taken by the Putin administration. On the 31st of October, the president signed a new bill on high treason. And in this law, the definition of high treason is overly broad, and there is a strong fear that it will be implemented arbitrarily, placing harsh restrictions on a wide range of activities by international organizations and their representatives, as well as on Russian human rights defenders and civil society activists cooperating with them. These examples, I will end now because I know you're longing for coffee. These examples show us that it is, I think, of utmost importance that we all, governments, parliamentarians in countries that respect and defend and protect human rights, as well as IGOs and NGOs, highlight violations of human rights, demand respect for human rights, and also hold governments accountable for violation of human rights. And also that we use every opportunity we get to do so. And civil society and human rights organizations, that is our work, that is what we do all the time. But I will also urge, governments and parliamentarians to use every opportunity to highlight the respect of human rights. And also finally, I think that these examples also show that we share the responsibility to support individual human rights defenders and civil society organizations in their work to defend human rights. And as I think that this is an excellent, forum, of course, that supports civil society, and I can't stress more than I have done, that this is very important work that you are doing. So again, thank you very much.